Hi, this is another MegaSplat development update. This will be the 0.94 version, I believe. Unfortunately, the 0.93 version is still waiting in the queue at the asset store. So hopefully that will come out on Monday, and then I can submit this on Monday or Tuesday and get this to you as soon as they can approve it. So there are two big new features in this version. So the thing we're looking at right now is this is a terrain that was created in a third-party tool called MapMagick. There's a bunch of different systems out there like Gaia and, that are very popular for generating terrains procedurally, placing objects on them very quickly. And most of these will use Unity's standard terrain texture, and sometimes they'll integrate with some third-party terrains, things like that. So the first thing that I really want to show off is a new tool that allows you to quickly convert from a Unity terrain to a MegaSplat terrain. So one of the things you'll notice right away with this is the intense amount of tiling that you see on this terrain. And because it's only limited to 4 textures, you know, it only really has a few different surfaces on here, where MegaSplat can support hundreds. Now, I haven't gotten to the point of integrating MegaSplat's capabilities, or rather getting the author of these types of procedural generation systems to integrate the capability for hundreds of textures yet. But what I have done is make it very easy to convert from the output of one of these programs to the MegaSplat format without having to repaint the whole terrain. So the way this works is that the first thing that we need to do, so what I did was I loaded up the demo scene from MapMagick here. And the first thing I need to do is I need to create a new MegaSplat shader and material for this. So if you haven't used a shader compiler before because it hasn't shipped, you go over to the right-click menu and you go to Create MegaSplat, and then you choose, in this case, a terrain shader. And this will create this MegaSplat terrain shader here. And what we can also do is create a material for it. We can name this, and let's actually name this MapMagick terrain, so we know what it is. And then drag the shader onto the material, and then select it, and go into our inspector. And here we see the MegaSplat shader and shader compiler or generator, and we can go ahead and set up its options. So we want to make sure that's terrain. It should have been terrain. It wasn't, so I'll have to look into that. I'm going to use the UVs of the terrain instead of, say, triplanar texturing. And I'm going to make a 2-layer shader because I love blending layers together. I think it looks really great. And then I'm going to use the really tight normal smoothness ambient occlusion packing, because that packing gives us the best packing to performance ratio for terrains that don't need things like emissive and stuff. I'm not going to use any per-text properties, but I can go ahead and set up, the macro texture or other features here while I'm at it. And then I'm going to go ahead and assign the splat maps here. So I'm going to assign my diffuse and normal SAO texture arrays. And then I probably want to set these scales to something a little higher so that we tile at a higher frequency. And I like my interpolation contrast kind of high, but again, it's all up to you. Now, you'll notice this is splat control texture here, which the terrain shader uses. We don't need to create this yet. It'll create that for us. But if you have one already that you wanted to map, you could use that. So I'm going to select the terrain here. And what we'll see is that this is currently using the built-in standard shader. Now, if we go to the terrain painter, it's going to tell us that we need to set this up and give us some steps there on how to do that. So what we do is we switch over to custom, and then we just drag our material in here, and we see that we have this MegaSplat terrain now with no textures or anything on it. So before, rather than painting all this, we'd like to convert and just get the painting that was there from the procedural texturing system. And so if we go to the terrain painter, it'll now ask us if we want to create that terrain texture to store the MegaSplat choices, the paint job. So I can go ahead and hit create it for me, and it will actually output a texture next to my terrain for me to store that information in. So now we could go paint our terrain. but that's not actually what we really want to do. What we actually want to do is use this new terrain converter here. So we select our MegaSplat diffuse brush, and what we get is a conversion option. So these are the 4 textures that were painted on this terrain from the Map Magic tool. And the one we can do is we can map them to texture clusters over here. And so I'm going to go ahead and select this grass for this one, and I'm going to select the moss for this one, which is, you know, a different hue, but if I was using similar textures, you know, it would map exactly. I'm going to choose some kind of dark rock wall, let's say, for this one. And actually, this one's pretty good for what this one is. So then I hit convert, and it now converts us to a MegaSplat format here. And then if I want to, I can come over to my MegaSplat painter here and just paint some more textures in. But what you'll notice right away is that you can't really see tiling anymore, because what MegaSplat does is these texture clusters allow it to paint down a sort of random splattering of these textures, so that you actually have 3 or 4 grass textures instead of just one, and that really helps break up any sort of tiling. But now that we're in MegaSplat, I can come in here and I can paint down, you know, a whole bunch of new textures, as many as I want, up to 256. You know, whatever I want to do. So I have a lot more capabilities, but I can very quickly convert from an existing terrain to a MegaSplat terrain. And then the other thing that I usually do is just turn up this distance to use the MegaSplat shader out into the distance there. A lot of the demos that I've all given, I've used a macro texture. And so what I like about a macro texture is, one, that it can save a lot of performance, because what you can do is you can generate a macro texture for the whole terrain that looks really great from far away, and then you know, blend into that from the MegaSplat paint job to that macro texture. And that can look really good. And it allows you to also process that so that it looks good in the distance. And it can actually save performance because we don't have to compute the splat maps really far away. So one of the problems that you run into with this is, how do I get that macro texture? In the case of the demo that I shipped with the game, I made that macro texture in GeoControl, and I started with that, and then I painted some stuff underneath it. And that works great because GeoControl has really nice output, and there's actually a Unity version of that plugin that I'd like to get a deeper integration with, because I think it has really amazing output. But anyway, now actually I can generate a macro texture from the splat maps. And this works both on meshes and on terrains. So I'm going to demo it on terrains, but the same process works on meshes. So if we go back to our terrain painter and go to our utilities panel, we can actually switch to the render baking. Okay, and what we do here is we choose an output path, and I'm just going to throw this in this folder I have here, and then I can choose a resolution for each of the maps, and then I can choose which of the maps that I would like to output. So I have the albedo, the height, the normal, the metallic, the smoothness, the AO, and the emissive. And normally we pack these all together, and at some point I might write a packer just so you can output right in the format you want. But right now they're all separate, and that's nice because you know, you could then go into your macro texture and decide to do you know, a different sort of, like the emissive you could treat, or without having to break it apart and put it back together and stuff. I'm just going to output everything here. And then if we export selected, what this is going to do is it's going to render out this whole terrain into a texture that is the albedo, the normal, the specular, the metallic, etc. It's pretty quick. On terrains, it's actually really easy to do. On meshes, it's a little more complex, but it works on both. There is one restriction on meshes, which is that if you select a whole bunch of meshes, and they all happen to use the same UV space because it's a bunch of instances of the same rock, then what's going to happen is each of them is just going to write over the previous one. So you have to have unique UVs if you're going to bake out a texture. This happens to work out, to be true most of the time on terrain, so that just sort of works. So now, if I go over to that folder that I output these into, you'll see here that I can now load up this albedo texture, for instance. Open that up in, well, just do a preview. And here's the albedo texture rendered out for the entire terrain. And so now I could go into Photoshop, I could treat this, process it, and use it as a macro texture for the distance view. And it'll go ahead and it'll output your normal map. So if we preview this one, and the normals on this are not great, so it wasn't a great example to choose. But basically, you can output all of the different channels of information so that you can see them. And again, I could show this working on meshes, but it's exactly the same process in both. I'm trying to keep the workflows as similar as possible, so that later when I come back and do lots of little tutorials on this stuff, then I don't have to record them twice. And it's just easier for users. So, just not bother with that. Come over here. So here you can see I've generated this macro texture in another program. And so we have some dissonance between what I've painted and what the macro texture is. So this is a nice way that I can fix that. Now, one thing that's kind of neat that comes along with this is if I select the MegaSplat shader now, you'll notice at the bottom here there's this little debug output tab. And so what's cool about this is this is part of the shader compiler, so it is actually going to recompile the shader and change the shader. But if you want to debug something, it can be pretty useful because I can, for instance, switch and just see the normal information. Now this is something you can do also in the Unity editor. In certain cases they have certain modes for this, and certainly in deferred rendering you can, because you can look at the gbuffer information. But actually being able to look at this information can be pretty useful when you're debugging, because being able to switch the shader like this just really lets you see how it all works without having to switch to deferred rendering, or if you just want to see the ambient occlusion information, for instance, like Unity's not going to show you that. So come over here, and then we see this is actually the ambient occlusion information mapped and splat mapped over the whole terrain. So that can be pretty useful for debugging, but that's actually what the shader compiler does when it's doing the render to textures. It actually makes copies of your shaders, sets up this rendering for them, outputs them to a texture, and in the case of the mesh, what it actually does is construct meshes that are laid out in UV space, and then takes little captures of them. So yeah, so whenever Unity approves the last update I submitted, I will submit this. I would submit this earlier, except that then it would kick me out of the queue, and you guys would all have to wait another week for the shader compiler. So I'd rather get that update out. I also fixed some bugs. One of my users was having a problem where he would press play in the editor, and the terrain would not be painted when it was in the editor. It turns out this is a regression of a bug that existed in 5.3. So I'm going to submit that with a repro to Unity as soon as I can and try to get it fixed. But I have put some code in which will, or rather remove some code, that will allow it to continue to work in the editor. So that bug is fixed. So yeah, if you're having any issues or questions, please reach out to me on the forum. And this is getting pretty close to where I want a 1.0 release. I think the big things coming up for me are possibly tessellation or parallax mapping. I've actually done some preliminary tests on some of that. Traditional parallax occlusion mapping is going to be way too slow, and so I'm looking into a different technique, which is where basically what you do is you can figure out which actual, with a very small number of tabs, figure out which which texture is going to win, and then only do your taps through that texture. So that is one possibility. The other is tessellation. I don't really consider those necessary for 1.0, but honestly, the biggest task I really have to do is get the marketing materials in order. I think the screenshots that I have up there don't really show off the product. The icons are not great. I've done a little bit of work to make them better, but I absolutely hate that kind of work. So I really need to force myself to do it, and adding some features like tessellation and stuff will be more just for me to not go insane. Okay, that's it for this week, and I hope you're loving the tool, and if you have any issues, let me know.